What kind of childhood breeds a monster? Is it a life filled with unimaginable pain and suffering, or is it something more elusive, something hidden deep within the shadows of a seemingly normal existence? To understand Sheila Labarre, we must first journey back to her beginnings, a time when she was just a child, full of dreams and hope, long before she became one of the most feared women in America. Sheila Labarre was born on July 4, 1958, in the sleepy town of Fort Payne, Alabama. It was a town where life moved at a leisurely pace, where the community was close-knit, and everyone knew everyone else. Surrounded by endless fields of corn, Sheila's early years could have easily been mistaken for idyllic. She was the youngest of 3 children, a bright and inquisitive girl with big blue eyes, golden hair, and a smile that could light up a room. Sheila had dreams like any other child. She wanted to become a famous singer or actress, to use her voice and beauty to escape the confines of her small-town life. But life on the farm where Sheila grew up was far from the idyllic scene that it appeared to be. The Bailey family's farmhouse, nestled in the midst of the picturesque countryside, hid a dark and terrible secret. Sheila's father, Manuel Bailey, was a man plagued by his own demons. His addiction to alcohol turned him into a tyrant, and when he drank, he became a monster in every sense of the word. Manuel's violent outbursts were a regular occurrence in the Bailey household. He would go on drinking binges that left him in a rage, lashing out at his wife and children with brutal force. The beatings were relentless, and anything within reach, a belt, a fist, even a piece of furniture, became a weapon in Manuel's hands. But the physical abuse, as horrifying as it was, wasn't the worst of it. Manuel's cruelty extended beyond the physical. He preyed on his daughters in ways that would scar them for life. From an early age, Sheila and her sister Lynn were subjected to their father's perverse and abusive behavior. The emotional and psychological trauma of these experiences left deep scars that would never truly heal. The farmhouse, with its creaking floorboards and the faint scent of corn wafting through the windows, became a place of nightmares for the Bailey children. The trauma they endured behind closed doors was a secret they carried in silence, a burden too heavy for their young shoulders. Despite the horrors she faced at home, Sheila was determined to escape. School became her sanctuary, a place where she could momentarily forget the terror that awaited her at home. She was a bright student, and her teachers recognized her potential. Sheila excelled in her studies, often dreaming of the day she could leave the farm behind and pursue her dreams in the big city. She wanted to become a singer, to stand on stage and let her voice soar above the noise of her troubled life. But even as she dreamed of a brighter future, the darkness of her past loomed large. The abuse she endured at the hands of her father shaped her in ways that no one could have predicted. It was as if the cruelty she experienced seeped into her very being, warping her sense of self and laying the groundwork for the person she would one day become. As Sheila grew older, the weight of her trauma became too much to bear. The cheerful, ambitious girl who once dreamed of a life on stage began to withdraw into herself. The spark that once shone in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a coldness that would only grow with time. The dreams of becoming a singer or actress faded away, replaced by a burning desire to escape, to run as far away from Fort Payne as she could, and to never look back. At the age of 18, Sheila finally left her parents' home, but the freedom she had longed for was not the escape she had imagined. The world outside the farm was harsh, and without money or a plan, Sheila found herself adrift. The dreams she had once held so dearly were now just distant memories, overshadowed by the darkness that had taken root within her. As Sheila ventured into adulthood, she quickly realized that the world beyond the confines of her family farm was just as unforgiving as the one she had left behind. The freedom she had so desperately sought was elusive, and the scars of her past haunted her every step. With no money, no formal education, and no support system, Sheila found herself in a precarious position. The bright-eyed girl with dreams of stardom was now a young woman struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to break her. Sheila's first steps into adulthood were fraught with difficulty. With no clear direction, she took on various low-paying jobs, eventually finding work as a maid in a local hotel. It was humble work, but it was enough to keep her afloat. Despite the challenges she faced, Sheila's striking beauty did not go unnoticed. Her golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and radiant smile continued to attract attention, especially from men who were captivated by her charm. It wasn't long before Sheila began to use her looks to her advantage. She learned how to manipulate the men who showed interest in her, using their affection as a means to secure stability in her life. But manipulation was not enough to bring her the happiness she sought. Her first serious relationship ended in disaster when she married a man named Jonathan Baxter. Jonathan was a young father, and at first, he was completely taken by Sheila's beauty and charisma. But the marriage quickly fell apart when Jonathan discovered a darker side to Sheila's personality. Jonathan had a young daughter from a previous relationship, and it wasn't long before Sheila's resentment toward the child became evident. The little girl, a reminder of the life Sheila wished she had, became the target of her anger and frustration. Sheila's treatment of the child grew increasingly cruel, culminating in physical abuse that Jonathan could not ignore. When he discovered what had been happening, Jonathan ended the marriage abruptly, throwing Sheila out of his life and vowing never to see her again. The failed marriage was a devastating blow to Sheila. The rejection and abandonment only deepened the wounds she carried from her childhood. Alone once more, she drifted from one short-lived relationship to another, each one more toxic than the last. The men she became involved with were often as troubled as she was, leading to a series of volatile and destructive relationships. One of the most tumultuous of these relationships was with Ronnie Jennings, a man who, like Sheila, was no stranger to instability. Their marriage was a constant storm of infidelity, arguments, and physical altercations. Ronnie, who had his own demons to contend with, often clashed with Sheila in violent outbursts that left both of them battered and bruised. The relationship reached its breaking point one night after a particularly vicious fight. In a fit of rage, Sheila consumed a cocktail of drugs and alcohol, her mind spinning with anger and despair. She got behind the wheel of her car and sped down the road, her vision blurred, her thoughts consumed by the chaos in her life. The inevitable happened. Sheila lost control of the car, crashing it into a tree at high speed. The impact was catastrophic, and for a moment it seemed as though Sheila's troubled life would come to a tragic end. But fate, it seems, had other plans for her. Sheila survived the crash, but her injuries were severe. She was rushed to the hospital, where she spent weeks in a coma, hovering between life and death. When Sheila finally awoke, it was clear that she had changed. The head injury she sustained in the crash had a profound impact on her personality and behavior. The doctors who treated her noted that she seemed more aggressive, more unpredictable than before. Her once charming demeanor had been replaced by a coldness that made those around her uneasy. The trauma of the crash, combined with the lingering effects of her childhood abuse, pushed Sheila further down the path of darkness. She returned home, but her relationship with Ronnie quickly deteriorated. The fights grew more intense, the violence more extreme. Eventually, Ronnie could take no more. After one particularly brutal altercation in which Sheila attacked him with a pair of scissors, he filed for divorce, leaving Sheila alone once again. With each failed relationship, Sheila's anger and bitterness grew. The dreams she had once held were now nothing more than distant memories, overshadowed by the darkness that had consumed her. She became more manipulative, more controlling, and more dangerous. The men who entered her life were little more than pawns in a game she was determined to win, no matter the cost. And so, Sheila continued her downward spiral, each step taking her further away from the person she once was and closer to the monster she would become. By the late 1980s, Sheila Labarre had become a woman hardened by life's cruelties. She had left behind the dreams of her youth and embraced a life defined by manipulation and control. It was during this time that she met Wilfred Bill Labarre, a man whose wealth and loneliness made him the perfect target for someone like Sheila. Bill Labarre was a chiropractor in his early 60s, living on a sprawling ranch in Epping, New Hampshire. He had been widowed for several years and was searching for companionship. When Bill came across Sheila's photo in a personal ad, he was immediately captivated by her beauty. She was half his age, with striking features that seemed almost too good to be true. For Bill, the idea of having such a young and attractive woman by his side was irresistible, and he quickly reached out to her. Sheila, ever the opportunist, saw in Bill the chance to secure the kind of life she had always dreamed of, one of wealth and power. Their correspondence began innocently enough, with letters exchanged and phone calls made. But Sheila knew exactly how to reel Bill in, sending him provocative letters and photographs that played on his deepest desires. Bill was hooked, and it wasn't long before he invited Sheila to visit his ranch. When Sheila arrived, Bill was completely smitten. Here was a woman who seemed to embody everything he had ever wanted: beauty, charm, and a seemingly genuine affection for him. But what Bill didn't realize was that Sheila's affection was nothing more than a facade. Her true intentions were far more sinister. Within weeks, Sheila had moved in with Bill, and their relationship took on a strange dynamic. Bill, who had always been the one in control, found himself increasingly dominated by Sheila. She quickly took over his household, making decisions about everything from finances to the daily running of the ranch. Bill's friends and family began to notice the changes in him. He became more reclusive, withdrawing from social circles he had once been an active part of. When they voiced their concerns, Bill dismissed them, insisting that Sheila was the best thing that had ever happened to him. But beneath the surface, all was not well. Sheila's controlling nature extended beyond household decisions. She began to isolate Bill from his loved ones, ensuring that she was the only person he could rely on. She monitored his every move, questioning him about where he went and who he spoke to. Bill, who had once been a strong-willed and independent man, was slowly but surely becoming a shadow of his former self. As the months went by, Sheila's grip on Bill tightened. She started interfering in his business, advising him on financial matters and even taking over the management of his chiropractic office. Bill, who was beginning to show signs of aging, was more than happy to let Sheila take the reins. He trusted her implicitly, believing that she had his best interests at heart. But what Bill didn't realize was that Sheila's motivations were far from pure. The turning point came when Sheila took it upon herself to change her last name to Labarre, despite the fact that she and Bill were never married. This was a bold move, one that surprised even Bill, but he didn't object. By this time, he was so deeply under Sheila's control that he would have agreed to anything she wanted. With the Labarre name now her own, Sheila began to consolidate her power. She interfered more and more in Bill's business, and as his health began to decline, she took over completely. Bill's children and grandchildren, who had been suspicious of Sheila from the start, grew increasingly concerned. They noticed that Bill was becoming frailer, and they suspected that Sheila might be the cause. But whenever they tried to intervene, Sheila would shut them down, insisting that she was taking care of Bill and that they had nothing to worry about. In reality, Bill's health was deteriorating rapidly. He was suffering from heart problems, and his once robust physique was wasting away. Sheila, ever the manipulator, took full advantage of this. She began controlling what he ate, when he took his medication, and even who he could see. The once lively and vibrant man was now completely at her mercy. When Bill died of heart failure in 2000, it was a blow to his family, but not entirely unexpected given his declining health. The doctors who examined him found nothing suspicious, and his death was officially recorded as natural causes. But Bill's children were not convinced. They believed that Sheila had been slowly poisoning their father, a suspicion that would haunt them for years to come. Despite these suspicions, Sheila was never formally accused of any wrongdoing. Bill's death allowed her to inherit his entire estate, including the ranch and his business. With Bill gone, Sheila was finally in control, and she wasted no time in making the ranch her own. She transformed it into a place of dark secrets, a house of temptation, where she could indulge her every whim without interference. But as Sheila's power grew, so too did her instability. The woman who had once dreamed of a life of fame and fortune had now become something far darker, a predator, using her beauty and charm to lure in victims and manipulate them to her will. And as the years went by, the true extent of her cruelty would come to light. With Bill Labarre's death, Sheila found herself in complete control of the sprawling ranch in Epping, New Hampshire. It was a large, isolated property far from the prying eyes of neighbors and authorities. This isolation gave Sheila the freedom to create the world she had always desired, a world where she held all the power. The once quiet ranch quickly became a place shrouded in mystery and fear, known to some as the House of Temptation, but more accurately described as a house of horrors. Sheila wasted no time in transforming the ranch to suit her twisted needs. It wasn't just a home, it was her domain, where she could reign supreme over anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. With Bill's wealth at her disposal, Sheila could afford to maintain a lavish lifestyle, but it was the control over others that truly fed her desires. Sheila's new life was one of indulgence, but not in the traditional sense. Instead of parties and luxury, she indulged in manipulation, cruelty, and dominance. She began inviting men to the ranch, men who were down on their luck, homeless, or struggling with addiction. These were the men Sheila preyed upon, knowing they had nowhere else to turn. She would lure them in with promises of shelter, food, and affection, but once they were within her grasp, the reality was far more sinister. One of Sheila's early victims was Michael DeLoge, a man who had fallen on hard times due to his addiction to drugs. Michael was vulnerable, desperate, and easily manipulated, exactly the kind of prey Sheila was looking for. She invited him to stay at the ranch, offering him a place to live in exchange for companionship and eventually obedience. At first, Michael was grateful. He had been living on the streets, and the idea of a warm bed and regular meals was more than he could have hoped for. But it didn't take long for Michael to realize that Sheila's kindness came at a steep price. Sheila quickly asserted control over every aspect of his life. She dictated what he could eat, when he could sleep, and how he could spend his time. Michael was trapped, with no money, no friends, and no way to escape. And as Sheila's demands grew more bizarre and cruel, Michael's situation became increasingly dire. Sheila's cruelty was not just physical, though there was plenty of that. She enjoyed breaking her victims down psychologically, stripping away their sense of self-worth until they were completely dependent on her. For Michael, this meant enduring constant abuse, both mental and physical. Sheila would berate him, belittle him, and manipulate him into doing things he never would have considered before. And when he tried to resist, she would lash out with violence, using anything at her disposal to punish him. Despite his attempts to escape, Michael was always dragged back to the ranch, either by Sheila's manipulation or by his own sense of hopelessness. He had nowhere else to go, and Sheila made sure he knew it. Over time, Michael's will to fight back eroded, and he became little more than a shell of the man he once was. In October 2005, Michael disappeared without a trace. When his family reached out to Sheila for answers, she told them that he had left her and she had no idea where he had gone. But in reality, Michael was gone forever, his life snuffed out by the woman who had promised to help him. Sheila's next victim was Kenny County, a young man with a low IQ who was easily manipulated. Kenny was working as a phone sex operator when he first encountered Sheila. She was one of his regular clients, and she used her enchanting voice and seductive words to draw him in. Kenny, who had always struggled to connect with others, was thrilled to have someone like Sheila interested in him. When she invited him to live with her, Kenny jumped at the chance, convinced that he had finally found the love he had always been searching for. But Kenny, like Michael before him, was walking into a trap. Sheila quickly took control of his life, isolating him from his family and friends. At first, Kenny didn't mind. He was so infatuated with Sheila that he would have done anything to please her. But as time went on, Sheila's demands became more extreme, and Kenny began to realize that he was in over his head. Sheila's treatment of Kenny was brutal. She would beat him, burn him, and subject him to all manner of physical and psychological torture. The once healthy and happy young man was soon reduced to a broken, terrified shell. He lost weight, his skin was covered in bruises and scars, and his eyes, once bright with hope, were now dull and lifeless. But despite the horrors he endured, Kenny remained loyal to Sheila, too afraid to leave and too broken to seek help. In March 2006, Kenny made a desperate attempt to escape. He was seen at a local store, buying large canisters of fuel, a purchase that would later be linked to his tragic end. The store clerk who saw him that day would later recall that Kenny looked sick, frail, and terrified. His cart, filled with items for his own cremation, was a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. When Kenny's family could no longer reach him, they reported him missing to the police, but by then it was too late. The search of Sheila's ranch would reveal the horrifying truth: Kenny was dead, his body burned and his remains scattered across the property. The police also discovered the remains of Michael DeLoge, as well as evidence suggesting that there were other, unknown victims who had met a similar fate. The House of Temptation had become a house of horrors, a place where Sheila Labarre's darkest desires had free reign. And as the investigation into her crimes unfolded, the true extent of her cruelty would shock even the most hardened investigators. Sheila Labarre, once a woman of beauty and charm, had become something far more terrifying: a predator who preyed on the weak and vulnerable, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. The horrifying discoveries at Sheila Labarre's ranch marked the beginning of the end for a woman whose cruelty had gone unchecked for far too long. The search of the property was like something out of a nightmare, with investigators uncovering more and more evidence that pointed to the unimaginable suffering of Sheila's victims. The quaint farmhouse in Epping, New Hampshire, once hidden away in the quiet countryside, was now the epicenter of one of the most shocking criminal cases the state had ever seen. The search began when Kenny County's family, deeply concerned for his safety, filed a missing persons report. They feared the worst, and those fears were soon confirmed. When police arrived at Sheila's ranch, they were immediately struck by the sight of several fires burning on the property. These weren't ordinary bonfires, they were clearly makeshift pyres, fueled by mattresses, wooden furniture, and other flammable materials. But what truly horrified the officers were the bones scattered among the flames. They were unmistakably human. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the police quickly secured a search warrant and brought in forensic experts to help with the investigation. As they combed through the property, the true extent of Sheila's depravity began to emerge. The farmhouse, once a place of serene rural life, had become a chamber of horrors. Bloodstains were found throughout the house, on the walls, the floors, and even the ceilings. It was as if a massacre had taken place within those walls, and in a sense it had. The forensic team quickly identified the remains in the fires as those of Kenny County. His death had been brutal, and the evidence suggested that Sheila had not only killed him but had gone to great lengths to dispose of his body in the most gruesome way possible. Nearby, investigators found the fuel canisters Kenny had purchased just days before his death, canisters that Sheila had forced him to buy, knowing full well what she intended to do with them. But Kenny wasn't the only victim. As the search continued, the remains of Michael D. Loge were also uncovered on the property. Michael had disappeared years earlier, and his family had long suspected foul play, but they had never imagined the true horror of what had happened to him. His body, too, showed signs of extreme violence and abuse, and it became clear that Michael had suffered greatly before his death. The discoveries didn't stop there. In addition to the remains of Kenny and Michael, investigators found evidence that there may have been other victims. A sump on the property yielded a collection of personal items, clothes, shoes, and other belongings that appeared to have belonged to multiple men. Some of these items were linked to unidentified human remains, including a set of fingers that were never matched to any known victim. The full scope of Sheila's crimes might never be known, but what was clear was that she had been responsible for the deaths of multiple men, using her ranch as a place to lure, torture, and ultimately kill those who crossed her path. As the evidence mounted, the authorities realized they were dealing with a serial killer, a woman who had used her charm and beauty to mask the true darkness that lurked within her. But where was Sheila now? The search of the ranch had turned up everything except the woman at the center of it all. Sheila Labarre was nowhere to be found. The hunt for Sheila became a priority for law enforcement. Her face was plastered across news reports, and her story captured the nation's attention. Here was a woman who had lived among her neighbors, attending local events and interacting with the community, all while hiding a terrible secret. Her ability to blend in, to appear normal, only made her more dangerous in the eyes of the public. Sheila, however, was on the run. She had managed to slip away just before the police arrived at her ranch, and she was determined to avoid capture. Her escape took her to Boston, where she hoped to disappear among the city's population. But even in hiding, Sheila couldn't resist her old habits. She began seducing a man who offered her a place to stay, using her charms to manipulate him into letting her into his home. But Sheila's luck had finally run out. The man, who had seen the news reports, quickly realized who his new house guest was and contacted the police. On April 2, 2006, Sheila Labarre was arrested in Boston. She was taken into custody without incident, and the relief among the community was palpable. The woman who had terrorized and murdered men on her ranch was finally behind bars. But as the legal proceedings began, the full story of Sheila's crimes and her twisted psychology would come to light, shocking even those who thought they had seen it all. Sheila Labarre's trial was one of the most sensational in New Hampshire's history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, onlookers, and the families of the victims, all eager to see justice served. But the trial was not just about determining guilt, it was also a deep dive into the mind of a woman whose actions defied understanding. From the outset, Sheila's defense team sought to portray her as a victim of her own troubled past. They argued that the physical and psychological abuse she had endured as a child, combined with the traumatic brain injury she sustained in her car accident, had left her mentally unstable. According to her defense, Sheila believed she was on a divine mission to cleanse the world of evil men, an idea rooted in a delusional disorder and exacerbated by signs of schizophrenia. To support their case, the defense presented testimony from mental health experts who had examined Sheila after her arrest. These experts described her as suffering from a range of psychological issues, including paranoid delusions and a distorted sense of reality. Sheila herself took the stand, recounting a story of how, during her time in a coma after the car crash, she had a vision of meeting God. In this vision, God supposedly told her that she was an angel sent to protect children from predators, and it was this divine mandate that drove her to commit the acts of violence she was accused of. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. They argued that Sheila Labarre was fully aware of her actions and that her supposed divine mission was nothing more than a convenient excuse to justify her heinous crimes. The prosecution detailed the cold, calculated way in which Sheila had lured her victims to her ranch, tortured them, and then disposed of their bodies. They presented evidence that Sheila had meticulously planned each murder, taking steps to cover her tracks and avoid detection. The most damning evidence came from the videotapes found at Sheila's ranch. On these tapes, Kenny County and Michael D. Loge could be seen making bizarre and obviously coerced confessions to crimes they hadn't committed. The men appeared gaunt, terrified, and in severe pain, clear indicators that they had been tortured into saying whatever Sheila wanted them to say. These tapes, along with the physical evidence of the remains found on the property, left little doubt in the minds of the jury about Sheila's guilt. The trial also featured testimony from Sheila's ex-husbands and former lovers, all of whom described her as a manipulative, violent, and dangerous woman. Ronnie Jennings, her second husband, recounted how Sheila had become increasingly aggressive and erratic after their marriage, culminating in the incident where she attacked him with scissors. Another former lover testified that Sheila had tried to convince him to help her kill Bill Labarre in order to inherit his estate, an allegation that painted Sheila as a woman willing to go to any lengths to get what she wanted. Throughout the trial, Sheila showed little emotion, her demeanor cold and detached. She denied all charges against her, insisting that she was only doing God's work. But the jury was not convinced. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. In July 2008, Sheila Labarre was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought some measure of closure to the families of her victims, who had waited years for justice to be served. But the true extent of Sheila's crimes may never be known. While she was convicted of the murders of Kenny County and Michael Deloge, the remains of other potential victims found on her property raised questions that would never be fully answered. Sheila Labarre's case is a chilling reminder of how trauma, manipulation, and unchecked power can combine to create a monster. Her story is one of beauty twisted into something dark and deadly, of a woman who used her past as a shield to justify her actions. But in the end, justice caught up with her, and Sheila Labarre will spend the rest of her days behind bars, her reign of terror finally at an end. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.